He signed the divorce papers with a grin. 7 years of marriage, and Gavin Mercer couldn't wait 60 seconds to light a cigarette on the courthouse steps. He thought he was done with her. He thought Celine Vale was nothing, a quiet, forgettable woman he'd outgrown. He was wrong. Because 20 minutes after those papers were signed, the entire waterfront shut down. Black SUVs, armed escorts, and a yacht so long it blocked out the morning sun. The city didn't know what hit it, but Gavin Mercer? He was about to find out exactly who he had married. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Gavin Mercer signed his name across the bottom of the divorce decree, the sky above Crestholm Harbor was the color of old pewter, flat, cold, the kind of gray that made the water below look like a sheet of hammered tin. He didn't notice the sky. He noticed the pen. Specifically, he noticed how smoothly it moved, how little resistance the paper offered, how easy it was to end 7 years in a single fluid motion. He straightened up from the notary's table on the courthouse steps, capped the pen, and handed it back without looking at the woman standing 3 feet to his left. Celine Vale, soon to be Celine Vale again, no longer Celine Mercer, did not reach for the pen. She waited while the notary processed the final page. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, wearing a gray wool coat that cost less than the parking ticket on Gavin's car. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except a small watch on her left wrist. No makeup worth mentioning. She looked like a woman who had come to pick up a permit, not dissolve a marriage. That was what had always irritated Gavin about her. The stillness, the complete, infuriating absence of drama. His attorney, a narrow man named Foss, who had been billing Gavin at $400 an hour for the past 8 months, cleared his throat. That's everything. Certified copies will be filed by end of day. Perfect. Gavin pocketed his copy without looking at it. He was already reaching for his phone, already composing the message he would send to Cora, his girlfriend, his actual future, the woman who understood what it meant to be seen in this city rather than simply tolerated. Celine accepted her copy from the notary, folded it once, and slid it into the small leather handbag she carried. The bag was old. The clasp was slightly tarnished. Gavin had offered to buy her a new one 2 Christmases ago, mostly because the old one embarrassed him at dinner parties. She had declined. Celine. He said her name because the silence was getting uncomfortable, not because he had anything meaningful to offer it. She looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, almost colorless gray. Not pretty in the way Cora's green eyes were pretty, but precise, like a scope. Take care of yourself, he said. She nodded once. You too. And then she walked down the courthouse steps, and Gavin watched her go because he expected something. A stumble, a glance back, some small proof that the past 7 years had meant enough to crack her composure for even a second. Nothing. She reached the bottom step, turned left along the waterfront promenade, and disappeared around the corner of a parked delivery truck. Gavin exhaled through his nose, something between a breath and a laugh. He typed his message to Cora. Done. Lunch? The response came in 11 seconds. A string of champagne emojis. He lit a cigarette, a habit Celine had never approved of, and leaned against the courthouse railing, looking out over Crestholm Harbor. It was a decent view, he had to admit. The old port district was being redeveloped. His family's investment group held 3 parcels along the northern waterfront. Once the zoning amendments cleared council next month, those parcels would triple in value. He had Alderman Purvis for dinner on Thursday to finalize the last obstacle. Everything was moving. Everything was finally, cleanly moving. His phone buzzed. Not Cora. His assistant. Cars waiting. Your 10:30 at the Tribune building. Hartley moved it to 10:15. Gavin dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and descended the steps toward the street. He never looked back at the harbor. If he had, he might have noticed the water. It started with the color. By 11 that morning, Celine had walked 6 blocks north along the harbor promenade, past the fish market and the old cannery building and the decommissioned ferry terminal with its peeling paint and rusted turnstiles. She walked at an unhurried pace, handbag over one arm, watching the water without any particular expression. The October air smelled like brine and diesel and something faintly metallic underneath, cold settling into iron. She stopped at a bench near the end of the public pier and sat down. She did not take out her phone. She did not open her bag. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked out at the harbor entrance, where the mouth of Crestholm Bay opened into the broader channel. At 11:17 a.m., the water changed. Not literally, but the harbor traffic shifted in a way that anyone with maritime instincts would have read immediately. The two commercial tugs that had been idling near the fuel dock moved, not to assist an incoming vessel, but to clear the approach lane. A harbor patrol boat that had been circling the outer buoys swung wide and held position at the edge of its jurisdiction, engine running, but the radio traffic from it went silent. A Coast Guard tender that had been tied to the municipal wharf slipped its lines and moved to the southern breakwater. The water, suddenly, had been cleared. Celine watched all of this. Her expression did not change. At 11:24, she saw the bow of the yacht cross the harbor entrance. It was black, not the glossy leisure market black of wealthy weekenders, but a deep matte finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, a color chosen not for aesthetics but for the particular way it disappeared against dark water. The vessel was 140 feet if it was an inch, low-slung and fast-lined, with the kind of hull geometry that suggested it could move at serious speed when it needed to. There was no visible crew on the exterior deck, no flags. The only identification on the hull was a small registration code near the waterline, and even that was in a font small enough to require binoculars to read. Celine stood up from the bench. From the direction she had come, 6 blocks south from the courthouse steps she had descended 20 minutes ago, came the sound of engines. Not one, several. Heavy vehicles, moving in formation. 3 black SUVs turned off Harbor Street onto the promenade and came north at a steady pace, unhurried, not aggressive. They stopped 20 yards from where Celine stood. The doors opened. 6 men stepped out, not police, not military in any official sense, but carrying themselves with the kind of disciplined economy of movement that came from professional training in environments where mistakes were not repeated because people who made them didn't get the opportunity. They were dressed in dark civilian clothes, no visible weapons, which meant the weapons were somewhere else. The man who came from the second SUV was different. He was tall, taller than the others, and moved the way very few people moved, like the space around him was arranged for his convenience rather than the other way around. He was somewhere north of 50, with iron gray hair cut close and a face that had been through enough weather that it no longer bothered pretending its softness. He wore a dark wool jacket, open at the collar. No tie. His hands were in his pockets. He stopped when he reached Celine. She turned from the water and looked at him. "You look tired," Damien Orsini said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." He looked past her at the yacht settling toward the dock. "I said you looked tired." Celine picked up her handbag from the bench. "How long did you wait out there?" "Since 7. He said it without complaint or reproach. "We watched the court filing go through at 9:43. Wanted to be ready." She nodded. "Thank you." "Don't." His voice was even, but there was a firmness in it, something that closed a door. "You don't thank me for this." They stood together for a moment, watching the yacht approach the dock. One of the security men moved to receive the lines thrown from the vessel's forward deck. The operation was practiced and efficient, a crew that had docked in ports where speed and discretion were equally important. "Gavin's people will see this," Celine said. She wasn't asking, she was predicting, knowing. "Yes." "What do you want them to think?" Damien Orsini was quiet for 3 seconds. In a man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that words, once spoken, became permanent facts, 3 seconds was a considered pause. "Whatever frightens them most," he said. Across the city, in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Tribune building, Gavin Mercer was in the middle of a lunch that had started as a strategic media consultation and was rapidly becoming something he couldn't quite categorize. Hartley, the Tribune's political editor, had ordered the salmon. He was the kind of man who ordered salmon in October, which told you something. He had narrow reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a voice that was perpetually slightly too loud for whatever room he was in, as if he had learned to speak in press rooms and never readjusted. "Your father's infrastructure announcement is the main story through Friday," Hartley was saying. "After that, the Purvis rezoning comes up naturally if we time the op-ed right. We're thinking your byline, we do the ghost. You give us access for the profile in December. Standard arrangement." Gavin was nodding along when his phone lit up with a message from Trent, his personal security coordinator. "Something happening at the harbor. South Promenade. Sending eyes now." He kept his face neutral. "I'm fine with December. We need to discuss the framing around the waterfront parcels." Another message from Trent. "Multiple vehicles. Not local. Unidentified yacht, large. Mercer, this looks..." Then, "Your wife is with them." Gavin set his fork down. "You all right?" Hartley asked. "Fine, excuse me 1 second." He pushed back from the table and stepped to the window, putting the conference room glass at his back. He called Trent. "Talk," he said when Trent picked up. "It's big." Trent's voice had that particular texture of a man trying to process what his eyes were telling him. "I've got a team on the promenade right now. Black SUVs, 6 at minimum, professional security. The yacht. I've seen this kind of vessel in briefings, Gavin. Not pleasure craft, not Coast Guard. This is... Where's Celine? Standing with a man at the dock. Older guy. Looks like management. My guy says the yacht crew is moving like they've done this 100 times. Silent operation, clean." Gavin turned away from the window. His reflection looked back at him from the glass. The same face, the same expensive suit, but something in the geometry of it had shifted, some invisible alignment gone sideways. "Who owns the yacht?" Silence on the line for 4 seconds. Then, "Gavin, you need to call your father." "Who owns it, Trent?" We're running it now, but the registration routing is... There are layers, okay? It's not clean, but the operational profile matches. It matches Orsini." The name landed like a fist. The Orsini family. Every person in Crestholm's power structure, whether they acknowledged it openly or handled the acknowledgement in carefully coded language over drinks, knew what that name meant. Damien Orsini was not a criminal the way local organized crime was criminal. Ambitious, territorial, hungry, ultimately provincial. Damien Orsini operated in the space between sovereign nations, between legitimate financial systems, and the shadow infrastructure that kept certain economies functional when official mechanisms failed. He was the kind of figure that governments negotiated with quietly and denied loudly. Gavin pressed his thumb into the corner of his eye. "That's not possible. I'm telling you what my guy is seeing. Celine doesn't... She's not..." He stopped himself. He was aware dimly that he was about to say something that would reveal the full extent of what he didn't know, and he didn't want Trent to be the person who heard it. "Pull your team back. Don't approach. Don't make contact. I'll call you in an hour." He hung up. He stood at the window for another 10 seconds, looking at nothing. Then he went back to the table and sat down and let Hartley talk about the December profile for another 20 minutes, saying the right words in the right places, nodding at the right moments, his face doing the professional work of appearing present, while somewhere underneath the suit and the careful posture, a cold and fundamental disorientation was beginning to set in. He didn't understand yet, but the beginning of not understanding had arrived. What? The cabin they gave Celine was on the lower deck, forward of amidships, and it was larger than the master bedroom in the apartment where she had spent most of her marriage to Gavin Mercer. The furnishings were dark wood and clean lines, expensive without being ostentatious, the aesthetic of people who required comfort as a functional matter rather than a performance. There was a desk, a narrow sofa, a bed with linen that smelled of something sharp and clean, like cold air off open water. She set her handbag on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time in approximately 7 months, to put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure the specific mechanism for that was fully operational at this point. She had done her crying in carefully measured intervals over the past 2 years. In the bathroom of the apartment when Gavin was traveling. In the car in the parking garage of her office building when the morning commute gave her 12 minutes of reliable solitude. She had budgeted her grief the way a rational person budgeted any finite resource, carefully, without waste, in quantities appropriate to what was actually needed at a given moment. What she felt now was not grief. It was something closer to the particular exhaustion that follows a sustained period of extreme precision, the fatigue not of effort but of sustained exactness, of holding every variable in mind simultaneously for so long that the muscles responsible for that holding had finally, with the signatures dry and the yacht moving out of Crestholm Harbor, been given permission to unlock. She sat like that for a while. Then she straightened up, opened her bag, and removed a small encrypted phone. Not the one Gavin or anyone in Crestholm knew about. She powered it on and sent a single message to a number stored under no name. Filed. Moving. Confirm receipt. The response came in 40 seconds. Confirmed. Phase 2 standing by. Federal contact notified. Freeze order on primary accounts initiates at 0700 tomorrow. She powered the phone off and placed it back in the bag. She stood, went to the small porthole, and looked out at the water passing. Crestholm's skyline was already shrinking behind them, the downtown towers reducing to a jagged silhouette against the afternoon gray. Somewhere in that silhouette, Gavin was probably making phone calls, probably calling his father, probably calling the lawyer who handled the things the other lawyers didn't touch. He would be afraid. Not of her. He didn't have the imagination for that, not yet. He would be afraid of Damien Orsini, which was the natural first assumption and was, in its way, a gift. Fear of the wrong thing would keep him looking in the wrong direction for at least the first 48 hours. She had used those 48 hours before. She knew exactly what they were worth. Gavin's father, Roland Mercer, received the call at 1:15 in the afternoon at his home office in the Mercer family estate on Cliffside Road, 3 miles north of the city center. Roland was 67 years old, a man who had spent 40 of those years building the Mercer family's influence through a combination of legal acumen, political connection, and the particular kind of patience that came from understanding that most opponents could be waited out if you could outlast them financially. He was not a warm man. He was a precise one. He had once told Gavin, when Gavin was 19 and had just made a decision Roland disapproved of, that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford, that clarity was the only currency that held its value in every market. He listened to Gavin's account of the harbor without interrupting. When Gavin finished, Roland was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're certain it was Orsini?" Trent's people confirmed the vessel profile. The registration traces. Trent's people are private security contractors who drink too much and invoice too much. Roland's voice was flat. But if their identification is accurate, he paused. "When did you know Celine had a connection to that family?" "I didn't." The admission cost Gavin something. He could feel it being taken. "I had no idea. There was nothing in 7 years that suggested 7 years." Roland repeated this not as confirmation, but as measurement. As an accountant might note, a figure that suggested the books had been wrong for longer than previously believed. The Orsini family doesn't maintain casual associations. If Damien Orsini was in Crestholm Harbor today, he has been aware of our family's affairs for considerably longer than today. Gavin felt the temperature in his ear canal drop approximately 3 degrees. "You think she was placed?" "I think," Roland said carefully, "that we need to spend the next 12 hours being very thorough about what she might know and what she might have documented." He paused. "And I think your mother needs to be made aware of this. Vivian doesn't need... Your mother runs 3 of the holding structures the northern waterfront parcels are nested in. If there is any possibility that those structures have been compromised..." Roland stopped. When he continued, his voice was a half-degree colder. "Get to the office. Don't use the main line. Tell no one else. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we can determine what to do about it." Gavin called for his car. He was in the lobby of the Tribune building, moving toward the exit, when his phone lit up with a news alert from a legal wire service he followed for professional monitoring. The headline was routine. It shouldn't have stopped him, and for a half-second it didn't. And then something in the peripheral recognition part of his brain processed the company name in the subheadline, and his feet stopped. He looked at the alert. Federal Financial Crimes Division issues emergency asset freeze. Halcyon Capital Partners, LLC, and 3 subsidiary entities. Investigation ongoing, details sealed. Halcyon Capital Partners. The name was not public. The name was specifically, carefully, not public. Halcyon was a shell entity, 2 removes from anything with Mercer on the letterhead, established through a law firm in a jurisdiction that was chosen because its disclosure requirements were geological in their slowness. The freeze order had initiated at 1:09 p.m. 40 minutes ago, 6 minutes before Gavin had called Trent from the Tribune conference room. His thumb was already moving to call his father back when a second alert hit the same service. Second asset freeze. Coastal Meridian Holdings. Related investigation. Coastal Meridian. He stood in the lobby of the Tribune building, and the marble floor and the potted plants and the security desk with the bored guard reading something on his phone all continued existing around him in the normal way that the world continues existing, even when the specific person standing in it has just felt the ground beneath them become, at a fundamental level, uncertain. He thought about Celine walking down the courthouse steps, the handbag, the gray coat, the absolutely undisturbed expression. He thought about 7 years of thinking she wasn't paying attention. He thought about what she might have been paying attention to instead. The lobby doors opened behind him. Cold October air came in. Somewhere across the city, at a harbor he could no longer see, a black yacht was carrying his ex-wife away from a marriage she had apparently, systematically, patiently, with the focused persistence of someone playing a very long game, been preparing to end in a way that was nothing like what he had imagined when he'd picked up that pen and felt how smoothly it moved. He called his father. Roland picked up on the first ring. "I know," Roland said before Gavin could speak. "Halcyon and Meridian." "How, Because mine went at 1:06. Roland's voice was no longer flat. It was the specific register of a man holding a very great deal of carefully constructed composure around a very new and very profound fear. 3 minutes before yours, someone sequenced the freezes. Someone knew the ownership chain." He paused. "They're working inward, Gavin, from the outside structures toward the center." Gavin leaned against the lobby wall. "How long do we have?" Roland's pause was 2 full seconds. "I don't know," his father said, "and I don't know who we're dealing with, and those 2 facts together—" Another pause. When Roland spoke again, his voice had reached a register Gavin had never heard from him before in 67 years. "Those 2 facts together are the most frightening thing that has happened to this family in my lifetime." The lobby doors opened again. More cold air. Gavin looked toward the harbor out of habit, even though he was blocks away and the view was blocked by 4 stories of commercial real estate. Somewhere out on that water, Celine Vale was watching the coast recede. And for the first time in their entire marriage, Gavin Mercer had absolutely no idea what she was thinking. On the yacht, as the city became a smudge on the horizon and the open channel widened around them, Celine stood on the stern deck and let the October wind come at her without flinching. It tasted like salt and distance. The wake behind the vessel was clean and white and immediate, and then the water closed over it as if the passage had never happened. Damien Orsini came to stand beside her. He brought 2 coffees in ceramic mugs. Not paper, not plastic, the kind of man who found disposability in small things aesthetically offensive. He held one out. She took it. They stood and drank without speaking for a while. Finally, he said, "Your attorney confirmed the court filing. Everything is time-stamped and entered. It's done." "I know." "The federal contacts received the first package this morning. The freeze orders are sequenced." He glanced at her. "It will move faster than you planned." "That's fine." "Faster means messier." "Messier is fine too." She held the mug in both hands, feeling the heat come through the ceramic. "Messy still leads to the same place." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you tell me something honestly?" She looked at him. "Did you ever love him?" The question sat between them with the directness that Damien Orsini applied to most things. No softening, no apologetic framing, just the thing itself. Celine looked back at the horizon. "At the beginning," she said, "I thought there was something in him that was worth what it would cost to stay." She paused. I was wrong about that, but I was right about what he knew, what his family had done, and what it would take to prove it. 7 years is a long time to be wrong about a person. It's also a long time to document a criminal enterprise. She lifted the mug to her mouth. The coffee was strong, no sugar. I used the time I had. Damien made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite agreement. He finished his coffee. He looked at the receding coast. His father will move tonight to protect the remaining structures, he said. They'll burn what they can. Let them try. Her voice was entirely calm. Everything they try to burn, I photographed 3 years ago. The wake spread and dissolved behind them. The city disappeared, and somewhere in the sealed evidence cache of a federal task force that Gavin Mercer had never heard of, 7 years of precise, patient documentation waited for morning, and the systematic end of everything the Mercer name had been built on. The freeze orders hit overnight like a controlled demolition, not loud, not dramatic, just the precise sequential collapse of load-bearing structures that had been holding up a very large and very carefully concealed building. By the time Roland Mercer's personal attorney called at 6:43 in the morning, 4 separate holding entities had been locked, 2 brokerage accounts flagged, and a series of wire transfers scheduled for that week had been suspended mid-authorization by a federal injunction that had apparently been prepared with a specificity that suggested months of preparation at minimum. Roland took the call in his study, standing up, which was not his habit. He stood because sitting felt like capitulation to something he hadn't yet named. How specific is the injunction language? He asked. His attorney, a woman named Braddock, who had handled the Mercer family's most sensitive legal architecture for 11 years and had never once called before 7 in the morning, said, entity-specific, account-specific, transaction-specific. She paused. Roland. Whoever drafted this had the internal account numbers, not the registered names, the actual routing identifiers. Roland said nothing for 4 seconds. That's not public record, he said. No, it is not. It's not accessible through standard discovery. No. Which means someone with direct access to the internal documentation, Braddock said, and her voice had the flat, careful quality of someone delivering a diagnosis they had rehearsed, provided it. Either a current or former insider, or someone with sustained, undetected access to your internal systems over a significant period of time. Roland set the phone against his sternum and looked at the window. The grounds outside were dark, the ornamental trees along the drive reduced to black shapes against a sky that was just beginning to consider the idea of morning. He thought about Celine. He thought about 7 years of Sunday dinners at this house, 7 years of his wife Vivian's barely concealed disdain, 7 years of a quiet woman sitting at the far end of the table, eating whatever was served and speaking when spoken to and looking at nothing in particular. He thought about what nothing in particular might have actually been. He put the phone back to his ear. Get to the office. Don't go through the main building. Use the Fenwick Street entrance and go directly to the server room. Roland assures the server room first. I need to know what's been accessed and when. He paused. And I need to know before Vivian is awake. He hung up. He stood in the study for another moment, in the dark, in the quiet of a house that was about to become substantially less quiet, and tried to calculate how much time he had, and found that the calculation required variables he didn't have access to, which was itself an answer of a kind. Then he went to wake his son. Gavin was already awake. He had been awake since 4, sitting on the edge of his bed in the apartment. Not the apartment he had shared with Celine, but the one he had quietly maintained for the past 14 months. The one Cora had a key to. The one that had seemed like the beginning of a future and now felt like a staging area for a disaster he hadn't finished understanding yet. Cora was asleep in the other room. He could hear her breathing from where he sat, slow and unaware and slightly irritating in its normality. He was looking at his phone. He had been looking at his phone for 2 hours, watching the alerts come in from Trent, from the Financial Monitoring Service, from a man named Calloway, who handled the darker edges of the family's political connectivity, and who had sent, at 3:47 a.m., a message that said only, Federal Task Force, not local. This is DOJ level. Call me when you're clear. DOJ level. The Department of Justice didn't spin up a task force for ordinary financial irregularities. They spun one up when they had something large enough to justify the infrastructure, when someone had given them a roadmap detailed enough that the destination was already visible before they started driving. Gavin thought about Celine at the courthouse, the gray coat, the handbag. He thought about the years she had moved through their shared life like something peripheral, present, serviceable, not particularly demanding of attention. He had attributed this to a personality deficit, an absence of ambition or fire. He had, on more than one occasion, said exactly this to Cora, framed as an explanation for why the marriage had failed, and Cora had agreed in that way she had of agreeing with things that confirmed what she already wanted to believe. He had built a story about Celine's smallness, and he had lived inside that story until it became the architecture of how he saw her, and now the architecture was showing him exactly what it had been built to hide. His phone lit up. His father. He answered it before the first ring finished. "Come to the estate," Roland said. "Now, don't bring Cora." "I'm already—" "Now, Gavin!" The line went dead. He dressed in the dark. Vivian Mercer was in the breakfast room when Gavin arrived at the estate at 7:20, which meant she had been awake for some time before Roland had apparently managed to reach her, or that she had never slept, or that she had some independent source of information about what was happening. All three possibilities were equally plausible with Vivian. She was 64 years old, the daughter of a shipping magnate, and she had been engineering the Mercer family's social positioning for 35 years with the focused, unsentimentally precise energy of a woman who understood that power in this particular stratum of society was maintained not through money alone, but through the careful management of what other people believed. She was dressed fully at 7:20 in the morning. Hair set, lipstick on. She was eating toast and reading something on a tablet, and when Gavin came in, she looked up at him with the expression she used when she was extremely displeased and had decided that a specific register of measured composure was the most effective delivery mechanism. "Sit down," she said. "Where's father?" "On the phone with Braddock. He'll be in. Sit down." Gavin sat. Vivian set the tablet face down on the table. She picked up her coffee with both hands and looked at her son across the rim of the cup. The look was clinical. The look was the kind of look that was doing a specific kind of accounting. "Tell me about Celine," she said. "There's nothing to—" "Don't." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I was perfectly willing to let you conduct your marriage however you chose because I believed the arrangement was fundamentally low risk. A quiet girl from an unremarkable family, no connections of significance, no professional platform, no reason for scrutiny." She set the coffee down. "I was apparently working from a profoundly incomplete picture. So I'm asking you now, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What did she know?" "I don't know what she—" "What did she have access to?" Not a question, an insistence on a different formulation. "Inside this house, inside your office, inside your communications, inside your financial records. What was she in a position to see?" Gavin's jaw was tight. The muscles along the back of his neck were tight. Everything from his shoulders upward was tight in the particular way of a man who has spent the night losing an argument with his own memory. "She had access to the household accounts," he said. "The main property management records. My general correspondence, not the restricted communications, those were separate. She was in this house every Sunday for—" He stopped. He thought about Sunday dinners. He thought about Celine sitting at the far end of the long dining room table, eating, listening, occasionally responding when someone addressed her directly, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about what else was in this house on Sunday evenings. "The study," he said. Vivian's eyes moved to a point somewhere slightly left of Gavin's face. "The study is locked," she said. The study was locked. "There was a hardware change 18 months ago. I remember because—" He stopped again. He remembered because Celine had been the one who found the contractor. He had asked her to handle it because he had a conflict that week, and she had managed it completely without incident, and he had thanked her and not thought about it again. Vivian put her hands flat on the table. "The contractor she hired," she said. I don't know if she... I'm saying it's possible that the installation was... that someone might have... Gavin? Vivian's voice dropped to a register that he associated with the specific moments in his life when she had decided that a situation required severity rather than management. If that study was compromised, then the documents in that study were compromised. And if those documents were compromised, then your father's investment correspondence from the past 12 years, including the communication chain with the Halcyon directors, has been in someone else's hands for 18 months. The breakfast room was quiet. Outside, a bird made a sound in one of the ornamental trees and stopped. "Mother," Gavin said, "don't." She stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she had the posture of someone who had practiced being taller than she was for so long that it had become structural. "Don't say anything that is going to make me want to believe you handled this correctly, because right now I need to be very clear about what the actual situation is, and your reassurances would only obscure that." She picked up the tablet. She looked at the screen for a moment. "I have 3 calls to make," she said, "none of which you are party to. Tell your father I'll be ready to speak to him at 9. She moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing." Gavin looked at her. "When you decided to divorce her," Vivian said, and her voice had gone entirely neutral in the way that certain very cold things went entirely neutral. "Was that your decision, or did she maneuver you into it?" The question arrived in Gavin's chest like a key trying a lock it hadn't been cut for. He thought about the past year, the gradual accumulation of small distances, Celine becoming incrementally less available without ever becoming dramatically unavailable, the way he had started spending more time at Cora's, not because Celine had driven him there, but because the space had opened up and he had moved into it as naturally as water moves into a depression in the ground. Had the space been arranged? "I don't know," he said. Vivian left without responding. Roland came into the breakfast room at 8:15. He had aged 4 years overnight. Not literally, but the compression of sustained stress on a face that had learned to project composure over a lifetime produced a specific effect. Something around the eyes went tight and didn't release. Something in the jawline hardened past its usual set that read as age, even when the change had taken hours rather than years. He sat down across from Gavin and looked at his son and said, "Braddock found activity in the server logs." Gavin said nothing. 18 months of intermittent access, a ghost account, read-only, not in the user registry, operating through a mirror node that routed the access through our own backup system so that the activity appeared as internal maintenance traffic. Roland's hands were on the table. They were very still. Whoever built it knew our infrastructure well enough to hide inside it. For 18 months. Minimum. Gavin pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. The pressure didn't help anything, but it gave the physical body something to do while the mind processed things it didn't have adequate framework to process. "Damien Orsini's organization," he said. "They have that kind of technical capacity." "Yes," Roland paused. "But the access preceded the contractor Celine hired by approximately 3 months. The initial intrusion used a different entry point, a vulnerability in the system we used at the time, which was patched in a subsequent update, but not before the ghost account was established." He paused again. "This was not a rushed operation, Gavin. This was planned from very early, possibly from before the marriage." The sentence took approximately 4 seconds to land its full weight. "Before the marriage," Gavin said. "If the Orsini family placed Celine, if her connection to them predates your relationship, she was 26 when we met." Gavin's voice came out different from how he'd intended it. Thin. "She was working at a nonprofit. She lived in a rented room in the Eastmere district. She drove a car with a cracked dashboard." "All of which is verifiable circumstantial detail," Roland said, "and none of which precluded a prior association with a family that is very good at making prior associations invisible." The silence in the breakfast room was a different kind of silence from before. It had more mass. "Then what do we do?" Gavin asked. Roland looked at his son for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a flash drive on the table between them. It was small, matte black, the kind of unremarkable object that became extraordinary purely by context. "There is a warehouse," Roland said, "Pier 41, Northport District. a leasehold under a name that does not connect to any Mercer entity. It was established specifically to be unsearchable, under a subsidiary of a company registered in a jurisdiction that does not cooperate with U.S. disclosure requests. He looked at the drive. Everything that isn't in the system, physical records, encrypted backups, the full correspondence chain with the Halcyon directors, the Coastal Meridian trustees, and 3 other parties whose names you have not heard and do not need to hear right now. Gavin looked at the drive. If the federal investigators reach that warehouse, Roland said. They won't have it from Celine, Gavin said. She didn't know about it. I never told her. You never told her about Halcyon either, Roland said. Gavin went quiet. The drive has the access credentials, Roland said. The warehouse has a physical lock system, biometric secondary. Your print is registered. I added it 4 years ago when we established the facility against exactly this type of contingency. He pushed the drive half an inch closer to Gavin. Go today. Take what needs to be removed. The rest you burn. Gavin looked at the drive. He thought about Celine, about the harbor, about the yacht and the black SUVs and Damien Orsini standing on the promenade like someone who had been waiting for a very long time for something he had known was coming. He thought about a woman sitting at the far end of a dining room table, eating whatever was served, looking at nothing in particular. He picked up the drive. He went that afternoon. He almost didn't. He sat in his car outside the apartment for 40 minutes, the drive in his jacket pocket, his phone full of messages from Trent and Calloway and Braddock, and 2 other names he didn't feel like looking at, and he ran through the calculus of what the drive represented versus what not going represented. And at the end of 40 minutes, he concluded that not going was simply a slower version of the same outcome, and he preferred to feel like he was doing something even if the something turned out to matter very little. Pier 41 was in the North Port District, past the commercial fish processing plants and the aggregate yards, in the section of the waterfront that the redevelopment money hadn't reached yet, and probably wouldn't for another decade. The streets smelled like diesel and fish meal and wet concrete. The warehouses along the pier were mid-century industrial, metal-sided, some with fresh paint on the company signage, and most without. The one he was looking for had no company signage. Number 41 was stenciled above the loading door in faded white paint. The roll door was down. There was a personnel entrance to the left, steel door, no windows, a keypad and a biometric panel beside it. He was 30 feet from the door when he stopped. The personnel door was not fully closed. It was resting against the frame. The latch engaged, but the door not pulled fully flush, a gap of perhaps 3 millimeters at the edge, enough to see that the interior light was on. Gavin stood very still. Then he moved to the door and pushed it open and went in. The warehouse interior was a single open space, high-ceilinged, lit by industrial fluorescence that gave everything a slightly washed-out quality. Along the far wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving units held labeled archive boxes, hundreds of them, organized by year and category. In the center of the floor, a metal table held a laptop and 2 external drives. A second door at the far end of the space, a fire exit, stood fully open, letting in cold air from the pier outside. He had been here twice in 4 years. He knew where the specific boxes were. He knew no one else should have known this room existed. And yet, standing at the metal table in the center of the warehouse floor, with her coat on and her hands still and her face as calm as it had been on the courthouse steps 12 hours ago, was Celine. She was looking at him, not surprised, not afraid. She had been waiting. Gavin felt his mouth do something that wasn't speech. He felt his right hand come up in a gesture that had no specific meaning, a defensive and slightly animal movement, the kind the body makes when the mind is momentarily out of available options. "How?" he started. "Sit down, Gavin," she said. "How did you... This facility isn't... There's no connection to... Sit down." He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway and looked at his ex-wife standing at the table in the center of a room that she was not supposed to know existed, and he understood, with the specific nauseating clarity that arrives when the last available alternative explanation finally runs out, that the woman he had spent 7 years underestimating had not simply been documenting the crimes around her. She had known where all of them were buried, every single one. And she had come here not to take the evidence. She had come here to make sure he did. He sat down, not because she told him to, because his legs made the decision independently of whatever was happening above the neck, some primitive load-bearing assessment concluding that the structural requirements of remaining upright had exceeded available resources. He found a metal folding chair against the near wall, and he pulled it out, and he sat in it like a man who had been walking for a very long time and had just now looked down and noticed he was bleeding. Celine did not move from the table. She stood with her hands at her sides and watched him settle and said nothing until he had finished settling. The warehouse held its cold. The fire door at the far end pulled air through the space in a slow, continuous draft that smelled of pier water and rust and the particular mineral coldness of October in a port city. The fluorescence overhead made everything look post-mortem. "You've been in here before," Gavin said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man reading a map he'd just discovered existed. "Yes." "How long?" "Does it matter?" "How long, Celine?" She looked at him steadily. "The first time was 14 months ago. I've been in 3 times since." 14 months. He did the arithmetic without wanting to. 14 months ago, he had been in the middle of the waterfront negotiation, the one that had required 6 months of dinner parties and quiet lobbying and a very specific set of documents being moved between entities in a sequence that was legally ambiguous on a good day and something considerably worse on a bad one. 14 months ago, he had also been sleeping at Cora's 3 nights a week and telling himself it was because the marriage was already over and everything but paperwork. 14 months ago, apparently, his wife had been standing in this room. "The biometric lock," he said, "has a maintenance override accessible through the building management system. The system was installed by a contractor whose certification was issued through a company that shares a parent entity with one of Damien's logistics subsidiaries." She said it without effect, like explaining how a dishwasher worked. "I flagged it 2 years ago. I waited until I needed it." Gavin looked at the shelving units along the wall, the archive boxes, his family's history in labeled cardboard, organized by year. "What did you take?" "Nothing physical. I photographed." She moved to the table, turned the laptop screen to face him. On it was a directory, hundreds of files organized by date. Everything is time-stamped, metadata intact, chain of custody documentation attached to each file. She paused. "It's already been transmitted. Copies exist in 4 separate secured locations. One of them is with a federal evidence coordinator who received it sealed 48 hours ago, contingent on my instruction to open it." 48 hours ago. 48 hours ago, he was in the Tribune building eating salmon he hadn't ordered and planning a media strategy for a political future that was apparently already a historical artifact. "So you came here today?" he said slowly. Because your father gave you that drive this morning," she said. "And I needed to know whether you were going to be stupid or whether you were going to make a decision that actually served your interests for the first time in 7 years. The sentence arrived with the directness of something thrown from close range. "You've been watching the estate. I've had visibility on your father's communication channels since the freeze orders went out. I knew he'd send you here." She closed the laptop. "What I didn't know was whether you'd come to destroy the records or whether you'd come because some part of you understood that destroying them was the one move that guaranteed you couldn't survive what's coming." Gavin looked at the flash drive in his hand. He'd forgotten he was holding it. "You want me to cooperate," he said. "I want you to understand what your options actually are, which is different from what your father told you they were this morning." Your father is protecting the family's assets." Her voice didn't change temperature. "You are not an asset to him right now. You are a liability with information. There's a difference in how those 2 things get managed." The draft from the fire door moved through the space again. Somewhere on the pier outside, machinery made a low grinding sound and stopped. Gavin set the flash drive on the floor in front of his chair. He looked at it. He looked at Celine. "Tell me something honestly," he said. She waited. "Did Orsini send you into my life? Was this from the beginning? Was this—" "No." The answer came immediately, and it had a texture the other answers hadn't had, something underneath the flatness. "I met you before I had any active involvement with Damien's organization. What I knew when I met you was that your family was connected to financial structures that had caused documented harm to a significant number of people and had never been held accountable for it. She paused. I thought you were separate from that. I thought you had a line. And when you realized I didn't, I called Damien. She looked at the shelving units. He provided resources, infrastructure, cover, nothing more. Every piece of evidence in this room and in those files was gathered by me, using my own access, my own documentation, my own legal strategy. She turned back to him. I was not a weapon pointed at you. I was someone who made a decision about what mattered more, leaving quietly and watching this continue, or staying long enough to end it. Gavin was quiet for a moment. The weight of the sentence settled. Then he said, My mother. Something shifted fractionally in Celine's expression. Not softness, more like the acknowledgement of a specific kind of weight. The international money laundering exposure, he said. You told me Vivian didn't know the full extent, the documents you have. How much of it is traceable directly to her? Enough, Celine said. Enough for what? Enough that her cooperation would significantly accelerate the federal timeline, and enough that without cooperation, the sentencing exposure for her specifically is, she stopped, chose the word carefully, substantial. Gavin looked at the floor between his feet. He thought about his mother in the breakfast room this morning, hands flat on the table, lipstick on at 7 a.m, asking him whether he'd been maneuvered into the divorce. He thought about 30 years of watching Vivian Mercer manage the world through a combination of social architecture and complete certainty that the rules were for other people. He thought about every Sunday dinner where she had addressed Celine with the specific polite contempt of a woman who had decided the target wasn't worth open hostility. How is your little organization, Celine? Still working with those families? Said with the inflection of someone asking about a hobby, a quaint, low-status hobby. She's going to be arrested, he said. Yes. When? The timeline depends on variables I don't fully control. But the federal contact who received my package has authorization to move on the primary targets once the financial forensics team completes the account mapping. She glanced at the laptop. Based on the pace of the freeze orders, I estimate 48 to 72 hours before the first arrest warrants issue. 48 to 72 hours. Gavin picked up the flash drive from the floor. He turned it in his fingers. It was a small object. It weighed almost nothing. What if I gave them this, he said, voluntarily? What does that do for my position? For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Celine sat down. She took the chair on the opposite side of the table, put her forearms on the metal surface, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for this specific moment in this specific conversation and was now in it. It depends entirely on timing and scope, she said. Voluntary production of material evidence combined with active cooperation on outstanding subjects can significantly alter prosecutorial recommendations. It doesn't eliminate exposure, but it reframes it. She paused. Your attorney would tell you the same thing if your attorney had full information, which your attorney doesn't. Braddock's primary loyalty is to the Mercer family entity, not to you specifically. She'll advise in ways that protect the collective first. Celine's voice was even. What is good for the family right now and what is good for Gavin Mercer personally are not the same thing. He sat with that. He sat with it for 30 seconds, which was long enough for it to become something he couldn't unknow. There's something else, he said, because he could feel it. In the room, in the specific quality of Celine's stillness, in the fact that she had come here herself, in person, rather than letting whatever machinery was already in motion simply grind forward. She looked at him. There's something you haven't told me, he said. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Yes, she said. And then she told him. It started 3 years ago with an anomaly in a financial trail she had been tracking, a specific pattern of transactions that moved through the Mercer family structures, not in the way the family's own people moved money, but in a slightly different rhythm, a different routing preference, as if a second hand were using the same infrastructure with slightly different habits. She had spent 4 months establishing that the anomaly was real and not an artifact of her own documentation method. Then she had spent another 3 months tracing it. What she found was not the Mercer family operating outside its own structures, What she found was someone operating inside those structures without the Mercer family's knowledge. Someone who had been using the Mercer financial network, and adjacent to it, elements of Damien Orsini's logistics infrastructure, as a conduit for a parallel operation that neither the Mercers nor the Orsinis had authorized or were aware of. A third party, Gavin said. A network, Celine said. Coordinated, multi-entity. The financial signature spans at least 6 separate criminal organizations across 3 continents, all moving money through legitimate adjacent structures like the Mercer groups without those structures realizing they were being used. That's not possible. Your compliance was calibrated to catch the specific kinds of irregularities that your own operation needed to avoid flagging. It wasn't calibrated to detect a different type of irregular traffic moving through the same channels because no one inside your structure was looking for it. Gavin stared at her. How long has this been happening? Best estimate? 8 years, possibly longer. 8 years. The number arrived with a kind of structural implication. It predated his marriage, predated the Northern Waterfront Project, predated most of what he understood as the current form of the family's operation. 8 years of a shadow using the Mercer name's infrastructure as a road. Who? He said. Celine reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded document. She placed it on the table between them. He reached for it. She put her hand on it first. Before you look at this, she said, I need you to understand something. The people named in this document are not people your family has a relationship with. They are people who chose your family's structures specifically because they assessed the Mercer name as useful cover, powerful enough to provide credibility, corrupt enough to be unable to report the intrusion without exposing themselves, and insular enough that they would never look outside their own operation for an explanation when things went wrong. They set us up as a blind, Gavin said. They used you as infrastructure. She lifted her hand. He unfolded the document. He read the first name and felt the bottom of something give way. The name was Alderman Purvis, the man he was having dinner with on Thursday. The man whose cooperation was the final piece of the Northern Waterfront rezoning. A man he had known for 11 years, who had attended his wedding, who had given a toast at that wedding about the importance of family and civic responsibility, who had sat across from him at a dozen working dinners and helped him navigate the specific political geography of Crestholm's power structure. Alderman Purvis, whose name appeared on Celine's document, not as a political ally, but as a coordinating figure for a financial network that had been routing money through the Mercer structures for 8 years without anyone in the Mercer organization catching it. He kept reading. The second name was worse, not because it was more powerful than Purvis, but because it was a name inside his own family. His cousin Ellery Mercer, quiet, agreeable, perpetually peripheral Ellery, who worked in a minor capacity in the family's legal department and had been there for 9 years, and whom Gavin had never thought about with any particular intensity because Ellery had never seemed to matter enough to require it. Ellery, who had apparently been the inside access point. The person who'd opened the door for the shadow network from within. The person who had, for 9 years, provided external parties with just enough internal visibility to route their operations cleanly through Mercer infrastructure without triggering internal scrutiny. Gavin set the document down. His hands were not entirely steady. Ellery, he said. The word came out strange, hollow. Ellery was recruited before he joined the family legal department, Celine said. Her voice was careful, not gentle. Careful. The people who recruited him identified the Mercer organization as a target and placed him specifically. His entire employment history with your family was constructed. She paused. He has been reporting on internal operations, providing access credentials, and facilitating the routing for nearly a decade. He was at my wedding, Gavin said. Yes. He helped me move into the apartment when Cora and I... He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Does my father know? No. Does Damien? I brought this to Damien 6 weeks ago. He was not aware of the use of his logistics infrastructure. He was... She paused, selecting the word. Significantly displeased. Gavin imagined what significantly displeased looked like on Damien Orsini's face and felt something cold move through his chest. Is Ellery still... Is he still in the building? Is he still... He was at the family legal department as of this morning, Celine said. I needed him in place until the federal contact was ready to move on the broader network. If he disappears too early, the network fragments and the main figures get enough warning to move assets. You've been managing his position, Gavin said. You've been keeping him in place deliberately. Yes. While he sits 30 feet from my father's office and... Gavin stood up. The chair made a sound on the concrete floor. He moved 2 paces and stopped because there was nowhere to move to. For how long have you been managing this? Since I identified him. 8 months. 8 months. He turned to face her. You have been sitting on the knowledge that a planted infiltrator is inside my family's operation for 8 months. And you did not. You never. If I had told your father would have confronted Ellery, the network would have received a warning signal, and the main figures would have had enough time to dissolve the operation before federal investigators could build a case. Her voice did not waver. I needed the case. Not just against your family, against the people using your family as cover. The people who are, by any measure, significantly more dangerous than anyone named Mercer. He stood very still. The draft from the fire door moved through the space. The fluorescents hummed their single flat note. You used me, he said. I documented crimes, she said. Crimes that were committed by people who made their own choices, including you. You used my family as bait for a network you were building a federal case against. Your family was already being used as bait, by Purvis, by the network, by Ellery. I was the first person in this situation who was using the situation to actually stop it. She stood up. Her voice was level, but had weight behind it now, the kind of weight that comes from a long time carrying something. I could have walked away 3 years ago when I found the anomaly. I could have taken what I had on the Mercer operation to a federal contact, handed it over, and let whatever happened happen. I would have been done. Safe. Clear. She looked at him. I didn't do that because the network behind the Mercer structures, the people using you, if they weren't included in the investigation, they would have simply moved to the next useful cover, the next family, the next set of structures, and it would have continued. Gavin sat back down. The chair received him without comment. He looked at the folded document on the table. He looked at his ex-wife standing across from him in a warehouse she wasn't supposed to know existed, telling him things that were restructuring the architecture of the past 8 years of his life in real time. Purvis, he said. Thursday. Thursday's dinner cannot happen, Celine said. When the warrant sequence begins, Purvis needs to be in a position where he cannot make contact with the network's central figures. Any communication from him to the primary coordinator at this stage, she stopped. It cannot happen. What do you want me to do? Cancel Thursday. He'll want a reason. Tell him the federal situation requires you to suspend all external meetings. He'll understand immediately what that means. His first instinct will be to protect himself, which will make him careless. She held his gaze. Careless is what the federal team needs him to be for the next 48 hours. Gavin looked at the flash drive still in his hand. He thought about his father pressing it across the breakfast table. The weight of it, which was almost nothing. The weight of what it represented, which was everything the family had built and hidden and maintained over 40 years of careful, patient, relentlessly self-serving work. He thought about Ellery sitting in the legal department 30 feet from Roland's office for 9 years, polite and peripheral and invisible, while everything he saw went somewhere else. He thought about Celine sitting at the far end of the Sunday dinner table, looking at nothing in particular. He turned the drive over in his fingers. Then he set it on the table next to the folded document. I need to call my own attorney, he said. Not Braddock. Someone independent. Yes, Celine said. You should. And then I need to understand exactly what cooperation looks like and what I'm committing to before I commit to anything. That's a reasonable position. And I need... He stopped. He looked at her. The question that had been underneath everything since the courthouse steps, since the harbor, since the breakfast room, and the flash drive and the walk through cold streets to a warehouse, he now understood had never been as hidden as he thought. I need to know if there's any version of this where what happens to my mother is... He couldn't finish the sentence. The specific combination of shame and something that was, Despite everything, still the residue of something like love for a woman who had never deserved it made the sentence unavailable. Celine looked at him for a moment. She didn't offer him false comfort. She didn't soften it. Vivian's exposure depends on the scope of her knowing involvement, she said. I've documented what I've documented. I don't have evidence that she directed the offshore structuring. What I have is evidence that she signed documents she should have questioned and didn't, and that she benefited from structures whose origins she chose not to investigate. She paused. That's a different conversation than direction. A federal prosecutor would see it differently than pure culpability, with the right legal representation making the right arguments. It wasn't a promise, but it was a door. Gavin picked up the flash drive. He placed it in Celine's hand. She looked at it, then at him. There's one more thing, he said, before I call anyone, before this goes any further. She waited. Ellery, he said, the network he's reporting to, the central coordinator Purvis would contact. Who is it? Celine was quiet for 3 seconds. The fluorescents hummed. The draft moved through from the open fire door. That's what I've been trying to identify for 6 months, she said. The financial signature points inward. Every routing chain terminates in a single entity, but the entity's ownership structure has 47 layers of shell incorporation across 11 jurisdictions. She paused. I've had the best forensic accountants Damien's network can provide working on it for 4 months. We're close. But close is not... Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression did something Gavin had never seen Celine's expression do in 7 years of marriage. It went uncertain. She read the message twice. He watched her read it twice. He watched the specific quality of her stillness change from the controlled stillness of someone managing a situation to something that was much older and less managed. What? He said. She turned the phone so he could see the message. It was from Damien. 4 words. We have a problem, and below that, a photograph. The photograph showed a man sitting in the back of a vehicle. The man's face was turned toward the camera at an angle that suggested he didn't know he was being photographed. He was somewhere north of 60, well-dressed, with close-cropped gray hair and a profile that suggested a face accustomed to projecting authority. Gavin looked at the photograph for 3 seconds before the recognition arrived. When it did, it arrived the way very bad things arrived. Not with noise, but with the specific silent shift of a foundation moving. The man in the photograph was not Alderman Purvis. The man in the photograph was Roland Mercer. His father was sitting in the back of a vehicle that, from the partial view through the window behind him, appeared to be parked on a street Gavin recognized as being 2 blocks from Pier 41. He had been followed here, and the photograph had been taken not by Damien's people, but, based on the metadata timestamp visible at the bottom of the image, 11 minutes ago, by someone who was not Damien. Celine was already moving, closing the laptop, pulling on her coat, scanning the warehouse space with eyes that had gone from uncertain back to something sharper and harder and entirely operational. We need to leave, she said. Who took that? Now, Gavin. He stood. The chair fell back behind him. He was moving toward the fire door when the sound came, not from outside, but from the personnel entrance at the front of the warehouse, the door he had come through 20 minutes ago. The sound of a lock disengaging. Someone who had a key. Celine caught his arm and pulled him sideways, behind the shelving units, into the shadow between the archive boxes and the wall, and they stood there in the cold and the dark with the fluorescents buzzing overhead and the sound of the front door opening and footsteps coming in, and Gavin pressed his back against the metal shelving and felt the cold of it come through his jacket and thought about all the things he still didn't know and understood, for the first time with complete clarity, that what he didn't know was considerably more dangerous than anything he did. The footsteps were not hurried. That was the first thing Gavin registered from behind the shelving units. Not the pace of someone who had found what they were looking for, but the measured, deliberate tread of someone who already knew what was here and was simply arriving to confirm it. One set of footsteps, then a second, slightly lighter, half a beat behind the first. Celine's hand was still on his arm. Her grip was not tight, but it was absolute. The grip of someone communicating a specific instruction through physical contact alone. Don't move. Don't breathe wrong. Wait. Through the gap between two archive boxes, Gavin could see a narrow vertical slice of the warehouse floor, the metal table in the center, the laptop closed, the folded documents still on the table. He felt the absence of the flash drive in his pocket before he remembered Celine had taken it, and that small gap in his inventory sent a wire of something cold through his sternum. The first figure came into the slice of visible floor. It was not Roland. It was Ellery. Ellery Mercer, who was 34 years old and had been working in the family legal department for 9 years, and had attended Gavin's wedding and helped him move into the apartment, and had sat through 100 meetings with the quiet, peripheral, reliably forgettable presence of someone who understood that invisibility was its own kind of power. He was wearing his work clothes, the slightly too conservative suit he always wore, the one that had always struck Gavin as the wardrobe choice of someone performing the idea of a young professional rather than actually being one. He stood in the center of the warehouse floor and looked at the table and the closed laptop and the document, and his face did something that Gavin, through the narrow gap between boxes, couldn't fully read. Then the second figure came in. Gavin felt Celine's grip tighten. The second figure was a woman, late 50s, tailored coat, dark, hair silver and cut short in a way that was not a concession to age, but a choice made from confidence. She moved with the unhurried authority of someone for whom rooms rearranged themselves. Gavin had never seen her before in his life. She looked at the table. She looked at the document. She picked it up, unfolded it, read the first two names, and refolded it. Her expression throughout this process remained the specific blank of a person for whom information was a tool and not a surprise. "She's been here," the woman said, "recently." Ellery's voice had a different register than Gavin had ever heard from him in 9 years of peripheral proximity. Lower, cleaner. The performance of the forgettable legal department junior was entirely gone. What was underneath it was precise and cold and slightly exhausting in its competence, the way very well-made machinery was exhausting. It didn't ask for anything from you, it just worked, and the working was somehow more unsettling than malfunction would have been. The laptop was running within the last hour. The ventilation on the processor is still warm. The woman set the document back on the table. "And the drive?" "Not here." "Which means she has it, or he does." Ellery turned and looked at the personnel entrance, then at the fire door at the far end. "He came in the front. If she was already here, they're in the building," the woman said. Not a question. Ellery looked at the shelving units. Gavin stopped breathing. Beside him, Celine was already not breathing. She had gone into a stillness that was so complete it didn't feel like a person anymore. It felt like the shelving unit itself, like the archive boxes and the cold metal and the flat industrial light. Ellery took 3 steps toward the shelving units and stopped. He stopped because his phone buzzed, and he looked at it and something in his face changed register again. Not much, a fractional shift, the kind a person makes when information arrives that is slightly ahead of the schedule they'd planned around. "The federal team moved up," he said. The woman turned. "How far up?" "They're executing the first warrants now. Purvis is being detained." He paused. "My contact inside the task force says the primary evidence package was flagged for accelerated processing 2 hours ago. Someone pushed the timeline." The woman was still for a moment, then, "She pushed it." "From the yacht. Before she came here, she pushed the evidence package to the federal coordinator and instructed them to accelerate." Ellery's voice was not panicked. It was the voice of someone recalculating without losing the thread of the calculation. "She knew we'd move on this location once the warrant started. She came here to get him out before we arrived. Then we're already past the containment window." "For Purvis. For the Mercer structures." He paused. "Not for the central ledger." The woman looked at the shelving units for a moment. Then she looked at the fire door. Then she made a decision that Gavin could see in the set of her shoulders before she articulated it. "We need the ledger," she said. "Everything else can be managed. The ledger cannot be allowed to reach the federal team. It's on the yacht." "Then we need the yacht." Ellery moved toward the fire door and pushed it open. Cold air hammered in from the pier. He looked out, scanned left and right, and pulled the door wider. The woman followed him. The warehouse went quiet. Gavin and Celine stood behind the shelving units for 3 full seconds after the sound of footsteps on the pier outside faded. Then Celine moved, and Gavin moved because she moved, and they came out from behind the shelves into the fluorescent-lit space, and Celine went directly to the table and picked up the document and looked at it, and then looked at Gavin, and her face had a quality he had never seen on it before. Not fear, but something adjacent to fear. The expression of someone who has run a very precise calculation for a very long time and has just encountered a variable the calculation didn't account for. The ledger, Gavin said. It's a physical record, the financial spine of the entire network. 8 years of actual transaction records, the real routing, the real names, not the shell structure, the actual principles. She was already moving toward the fire door. I have a copy, but if they reach the original on the yacht before, they said they need the yacht. I know what they said. Celine, who was that woman? She pushed the fire door open. The pure air hit them both. She was moving fast now, not running, but the step below running. The pace of someone for whom running would attract the wrong attention, but walking was no longer sufficient. Her name is Corva, Celine said. She's the coordinator, the central figure, the one the financial signature pointed to. She didn't look at him as she said it. She was scanning the pier, looking left toward the open water, right toward the aggregate yards and the access road. She's been the architecture behind the network for 12 years. She used Purvis as a domestic political conduit, and your family's structures as a financial shell, and Ellery as an inside access point, and she has been 3 steps ahead of every law enforcement agency that's ever come close to her, because she is very good at building situations where the people closest to her don't know she exists. How did you find her? The ledger. She turned left. The ledger is how I found her. She made 1 mistake in 12 years. She kept a physical record because she doesn't trust digital infrastructure, and the person she trusted to hold the physical record made 1 contact 6 months ago that I was in a position to intercept. Who held the record? Celine stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. The pier stretched behind her, the gray water beyond it, a crane on the far side of the basin moving in slow industrial arcs against the sky. Damien, she said. The person Corva trusted to hold the ledger was Damien Orsini. The sentence arrived like a structural failure, not an explosion, but the specific sound of load-bearing material giving way. Damien has the ledger, Gavin said. Damien had the ledger. He didn't know what it was. Corva's people delivered it to one of his logistics facilities 3 years ago as part of a storage arrangement, encrypted, labeled as archived business records from a legitimate client. She started walking again, faster now. I found it 6 months ago when I was reviewing his facility manifests. I told him what it was 2 months ago. And Damien was... She paused, choosing the word again the way she chose words when the accurate word was one she'd rather not use. Corva's network had used his infrastructure for 8 years without his knowledge or consent. He was not pleased. You said that. You said significantly displeased. I was being conservative. She turned off the pier onto a narrow access road that ran between 2 warehouses toward a chain-link gate at the far end. He agreed to hold the ledger in a secured location on the yacht pending my instruction. The arrangement was that once the federal case was ready to receive it as evidence, he would transfer it through a legal channel I established. But Corva knows it's on the yacht. Corva just found out, which means Ellery told her within the last... She looked at her phone. Within the last 6 hours. Which means Ellery knew within the last 6 hours. Which means my contact inside Damien's operation... She stopped at the chain-link gate. It was padlocked. She looked at the lock for 1 second and then pulled a key from her coat pocket and used it, and the gate swung open. You had a key to this gate, Gavin said. I have keys to a number of things. She went through the gate without looking back to see if he followed. He followed. The car was a dark gray sedan parked on the service road outside the gate, unremarkable in every visible aspect, except that when Celine approached it, the driver's door opened immediately, which meant someone had been watching the gate and knew she was coming. The driver was one of Damien's people. Gavin recognized him from the harbor, one of the 6 who had stepped out of the SUVs. He was a compact man with a face that had stopped registering emotion somewhere around its 3rd decade and hadn't restarted. Celine got in the passenger side. Gavin got in the back. The driver was already moving before the doors were fully closed. Where's Damien? Celine said. Yacht. He got your message. The driver navigated the service road without looking at anything except what was directly in front of him. He's holding position at the outer mooring. Didn't want to bring it back to the main harbor until you confirmed. Corva's people are moving toward the water. How many? I saw 2. There will be more. She looked at her phone. Damien needs to know the federal team's timeline has moved up. The first warrants are executing now. She calculated. He has a window before the federal coordinator tries to contact him directly to arrange the ledger transfer. Once that contact is made, Corva's people will know the exact location because they have someone inside the federal task force. Gavin looked up from the back seat. Someone inside the federal? Yes. Your contact inside the task force, the one you sent the evidence package to, is not the compromised person. The compromised person is lower level, traffic analysis. They've been feeding Corva the communication metadata, not the content of the evidence, but the timing and routing of federal contacts, which is enough to tell her when a critical action is about to occur and where. She was typing on the phone as she talked. Damien needs to move the yacht before the federal contact is made. Once he moves, the metadata tells Corva's inside person that movement has occurred, but not where he's going. She'll lose the thread for approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes is what I have to work with. The car turned onto a wider road heading north, parallel to the waterfront. Through the window, Gavin could see the basin expanding, the open water of the channel beyond it, the gray-green of the harbor under the afternoon sky that had gone from overcast to something heavier, a sky that was deciding about rain and had almost decided. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His father. He let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, then immediately rang again. "Answer it," Celine said without looking up from her own phone. He answered. "Where are you?" Roland's voice had lost the careful composure. Something underneath it had been disturbed in a way that composure could no longer fully cover. Are you at the warehouse?" "I was." "There was a car watching it, Gavin. I drove past. I saw there was a car on the access road that was not ours and not federal, and I've been trying to reach you for 40 minutes. I know, I'm out." "With her?" The question hung in the car. Celine was watching the side mirror. The driver had his eyes on the road. "Yes," Gavin said. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. "What did she tell you?" Roland said. Gavin looked at Celine. She was still watching the mirror, her jaw set, her eyes doing the rapid, quiet work of someone tracking multiple variables simultaneously. "Enough," Gavin said. "Dad." "Ellery." Silence. "Ellery has been a planted infiltrator inside the legal department for 9 years, Gavin said. He's been working for the network that's been using our structures as cover. He's the inside access point." The silence on the other end of the line was not the silence of a man receiving new information. It was the silence of a man whose suspicion was being confirmed. "You knew," Gavin said. "I suspected," Roland said. 2 months ago. A document I didn't remember authorizing appeared in the filing system with my signature on it. I've been trying to verify without alerting anyone inside. 2 months ago, and you didn't tell me. I didn't know who else might be involved." Roland's voice had a quality Gavin had never heard in it before. It was not weakness. Roland Mercer did not produce weakness as a vocal register. It was the sound of a man who had been managing an unbearable situation alone for 2 months, and was, in this moment, on the phone with his son, fractionally releasing the management of it. "I didn't know how far it went. I didn't know if I was involved. I didn't know." Gavin sat with that for a moment. His father, for 2 months, not knowing whether his own son was part of what had been eating the family from the inside. "I'm not," Gavin said. "I know that now." "Where is Ellery right now?" "He left the building an hour ago. I've had him followed since last week. My man followed him to the North Port District." Roland paused. "To your warehouse." "He was there. He's moving now. He's with someone named Corva, a woman, older, silver hair. I don't know that name. She's the principal, the one running the network." Gavin looked at Celine, who was now on her own call, speaking in a low, rapid voice. "She's going for the yacht. There's a physical ledger on Damien Orsini's yacht that has the full transaction record of the network. Real names, real routing, 12 years of it. She wants it before it reaches the federal team." Roland was quiet for 4 seconds. If Orsini's yacht is in the harbor, it's at an outer mooring, it's moving. Gavin watched Celine end her call and turn in her seat. Dad, I need you to do something. What? Call Braddock. Tell her to prepare full voluntary cooperation documentation for both of us. Broad scope. Everything. He paused. Tell her we're coming in. Roland said nothing for 3 seconds. Everything, he said. Everything that matters. Everything that's ours to give. Gavin felt the sentence cost him something as he said it. Felt it extract payment from a place he hadn't known had a balance. The things that aren't ours to give. The Shadow Network. The Corva operation. That goes to the federal team through a separate channel. But the Mercer structures, the waterfront, the offshore entities, Halcyon, all of it. That goes through Braddock as voluntary production. Tonight. Another silence. Your mother, Roland said. Gets the same advice I got, Gavin said. Cooperation is the only version of this where there's anything left at the end. He heard his father breathe. One breath, slow, the breath of a man accepting something very large. All right, Roland said. The line went quiet. Gavin lowered the phone. Celine was watching him from the front seat. Her expression was not readable in any simple way. It had too many things in it simultaneously, the way a piece of music had too many notes to hold individually. Damien's moving the yacht, she said. He'll be at the secondary mooring in 22 minutes, but the federal coordinator is going to try to make contact in... She checked her phone. In approximately 35 minutes. If Corva's inside person sees that contact attempt and Damien doesn't respond because he's in transit, she'll know something changed and she'll push Ellery and whoever else she has toward the secondary mooring. How does she know about the secondary mooring? She might not, but I have to assume she has the same quality of preparation for this situation that she's had for every other situation for 12 years. Celine looked at the driver. How far? 12 minutes to the secondary access point, the driver said. Go faster. He went faster. Yes. The secondary mooring was at the north end of the basin, past the commercial marine service yards, accessible by a floating dock that was technically part of a private marine facility. The facility's gate was open when they arrived, which meant Damien's people had been through it recently. They parked on the gravel approach and moved on foot down the ramp to the floating dock. The water here was calmer than the open harbor, sheltered by the breakwater, and it smelled of marine paint and bilge and the specific dead animal saltiness of shallow harbor water in late autumn. The yacht was not at the dock. It was 100 yards out, engines idling, making slow headway into the sheltered basin. Moving, but not quickly. Holding a position that could become either approach or departure depending on what the next 60 seconds required. A rigid inflatable boat was tied to the floating dock's far end. One of Damien's people stood beside it. Celine looked at the inflatable. She looked at the yacht. She made a calculation that Gavin could see her making and turned to him. You don't have to come, she said. I know. What's on that yacht is the last piece, the ledger plus the copy I made. Together, they're sufficient for the federal case to proceed against Corva and the full network. Without the original, my copy is strong, but challengeable. With both, she looked at the water. With both, it's over. I know, he said again. Gavin. She said his name differently than she had said it in the warehouse. Different from the courthouse steps, different from 7 years of Sunday dinners. She said it like it was just a word, just a name. Just the sound a person made to get another person's attention. Whatever happens on that boat, your cooperation with the federal team stands regardless. You've already made that call. It doesn't depend on the ledger. I know that too. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, turned, and got in the inflatable. He got in behind her. Damien Orsini was on the stern deck when they came aboard, and he looked different from the man who had stood on the promenade in the morning harbor light with his hands in his pockets and the easy authority of someone for whom the world arranged itself. He still had the authority. It wasn't the kind of thing that switched off, but there was something underneath it now, a specific tension in the way he stood that Gavin read as controlled fury. Corva, he said, when Celine set foot on the deck. She knows the ledger is here. I gathered that. His voice was the voice of a man keeping several very large things in a very small container. She used my infrastructure for 8 years. Yes. Without my knowledge. Yes, Damien. And Ellery, the person she placed inside the Mercer organization, used the Mercer organization's connection to my logistics subsidiary as a secondary routing layer, which means that for 8 years, the federal agencies tracking her operation have been looking at transaction patterns that put my name 2 removes from her activity. He looked at Gavin. Your cousin has been using both of our organizations as camouflage for a woman neither of us knew existed. Gavin said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. The ledger, Celine said. Where? Below. Secure room, aft of the engine compartment. Damien turned and moved toward the interior hatch. My people have been watching the approach. We have... He stopped. One of his security team was coming up from the forward deck, moving fast, with the focused, clipped gait of someone delivering urgent information. Boat, the man said. Fast approach from the basin entrance, not Coast Guard, not Harbor Patrol. Damien looked at Celine. She looked at the basin entrance. A dark, rigid inflatable, larger than the one they'd come in, with a more powerful outboard, was cutting across the basin at a pace that was not the pace of marina traffic. It had 4 occupants. Corva, Gavin said. Her people, Celine said. She won't be on that boat. Can we outrun them? Gavin asked. To open water, yes, Damien said. To a federal handoff point before the federal coordinator's contact window closes. He looked at Celine. She was doing the calculation. He could see her doing it. The specific look of someone for whom calculation was not an abstract process, but a physical one, something that happened in the eyes and jaw and the set of the shoulders. We can't outrun them and make the handoff in time, she said. If we run, Corva's people follow. The federal contact is a scheduled location. If we're followed to that location, the compromised person inside the task force sees the metadata, Gavin said. And Corva knows where the transfer happened and who facilitated it, and the federal case has a contamination problem before it even closes. The inflatable was closer now. Gavin could see the 4 figures in it more clearly. 3 men and, in the stern, a smaller figure operating the outboard, whose silver hair was visible even from this distance. Celine saw it too. She's on the boat, Gavin said. Yes. Celine's voice was flat, but something underneath it had changed. Something had sharpened past its usual register. She came herself. Why? Because the ledger has her real name, her actual name, not the operational alias. Celine didn't look away from the approaching boat. She's been Corva for 12 years. No law enforcement database has her actual identity. The ledger is the only document in existence that has both the operational record and the real name attached to it. She paused. She can't send people to get it. She has to come herself, because her people don't know her real name either. The boat was 70 yards out, 60. Damien turned to his security team and spoke in a low voice. 2 of his people moved to the stern rail. The 3rd went below. I need to get to the secure room, Celine said. Celine, Gavin caught her arm. She turned. He looked at her, and he thought about the warehouse and the courthouse steps, and 7 years, and the handbag, and the gray coat, and everything he hadn't seen, and he said, whatever she has on that boat, she didn't come here just for the ledger. She came to stop you from delivering it. She knows who you are. She's known who you are, and she let you build this case for 7 years because she thought she had time to contain it, and now she doesn't have time anymore, and she is 40 yards away, and she came herself. Celine looked at him. I know, she said. Then you know she's not going to let you walk off this yacht with that ledger. I know that too. The inflatable hit 30 yards. Damien's people had positioned themselves at the stern rail and the side deck. The 3rd one came up from below carrying a waterproof case the size of a large book, which he handed to Damien, who held it with both hands and looked at Celine. The ledger, Damien said. The inflatable's outboard cut to idle. 20 yards of gray harbor water separated the 2 vessels. In the stern of the inflatable, the woman with silver hair looked up at the yacht deck and found Celine across that 20 yards of water with the precision of someone who had been looking for this specific face in this specific context for a very long time and had known exactly what it would look like when she found it. She said nothing. Celine said nothing. The water moved between them, small harbor chop, nothing dramatic. Then Corva reached into her coat. and Damien Orsini stepped in front of Celine with the waterproof case in his hands and his body between her and the inflatable. And one of his security people shouted something in a language Gavin didn't speak, and Gavin moved without deciding to move. He moved the way the body moves when it makes a decision the mind hasn't caught up with yet, stepping left and forward and putting himself at Celine's side rather than behind the only available cover. She grabbed his arm. He didn't move back. Corva's hand came out of her coat holding not a weapon but a phone, which she held up so the screen was visible across 20 yards of harbor water. On the screen was a document. Even at this distance, even across gray water in gray afternoon light, Celine went still in a way that told Gavin the document was something she recognized. "What is that?" he said. Celine's jaw was tight. Her hand on his arm had gone from a grip to something closer to a hold. "That," she said, "is the one thing I did not account for." The document on Corva's phone was a custody agreement, not a legal instrument, not a court filing. Something older and more absolute than either of those things. A handwritten record, photographed and digitized, bearing 2 signatures and a date that was 11 years in the past. The handwriting on the left side of the signature line was Celine's. The handwriting on the right side belonged to Damien Orsini. Gavin looked at it across 20 yards of harbor water, and then looked at Celine and found her face doing something he had never seen it do in 7 years of marriage, or in the hours since the courthouse steps. It was not fear. It was the expression of someone who has built a very precise structure over a very long time and has just watched a single load-bearing element be removed from underneath it. Not the collapse? Not yet. But the specific suspended second before the collapse in which the structure is still standing, and the person who built it knows with complete certainty that it will not be standing in the next second. "What is that?" Gavin said again. Celine didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the document on Corva's phone with the kind of focus that excluded everything else, the kind that was doing its own rapid, private accounting. Damien spoke first. His voice was very low and very controlled, and had the quality of a man choosing words with the particular care of someone who understands that the wrong word right now will cost more than he can afford. 11 years ago, he said, my organization was under federal investigation. A broad inquiry, poorly targeted, but broad enough to create liability for several of my associates. Celine had access at that time to information that could have been used to narrow the inquiry towards specific individuals and away from the operation as a whole. He paused. She provided that information. In exchange, I provided resources, financial and logistical, to support her work. The document is the record of that arrangement. Gavin looked at him, then at Celine. "You were working with him before we met," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes." "Before we met?" "Yes." The word landed twice because it needed to. The chronology of it required a moment to restructure 7 years of assumption. 7 years of believing he understood the order of things, who Celine had been before him, what she had brought into the marriage and what she had developed inside it. The rearrangement was not loud. It was quiet in the specific way of large things shifting. "She built her case on the resources I provided," Damien said. "The encrypted phones, the secure documentation infrastructure, the legal architecture for the evidence chain. None of that was self-funded." He looked at Corva across the water, which means, technically, a federal prosecutor could characterize the evidence collection as having been conducted under the organizational auspices of a criminal enterprise, which would create chain of custody problems, which would make the evidence challengeable. Gavin looked at Celine. "Is that true?" he said. "It's a legal argument," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was effort in the steadiness now, the effort of someone maintaining a structure under load. "It's not a strong one. The evidence itself is clean. The documentation methodology is airtight. The chain of custody is independently verifiable. But it's an argument that could delay proceedings," Gavin said, "for months, long enough for Corva's network to dissolve and move." Celine was quiet for 1 second. "Yes," she said. Corva lowered the phone. She spoke for the first time, and her voice carried across the water with the ease of someone who had spent decades in rooms where being clearly heard was a professional requirement. "Walk away," she said. She was speaking to Celine. Only to Celine. The rest of them, Gavin, Damien, the security people at the rail, were furniture. The ledger goes with me. The document goes with me. The federal case proceeds against the Mercer family and the domestic political network, Purvis, the waterfront corruption, the offshore structures. It's a significant case. It satisfies the federal team. It ends the career of everyone in this city whose name appears in your files. She paused. And my network and its principles and 12 years of operational history disappear. No one who matters to you gets hurt. And you? She looked at Celine with something that was almost respect. The specific almost respect of one very competent person acknowledging another across a situation that had required both of them to be operating at the limit of their respective capabilities. You get to be done. The water moved between the two vessels. Celine said nothing. Corva's expression shifted fractionally. You've been doing this for 7 years. You've paid for it in ways that don't show up in evidence files. Walk away with what you've built. Let the domestic case close. It's enough. Gavin watched Celine's face. He watched the calculation happen. Not the fast calculation of tactics, not the rapid variable tracking he'd seen her do in the warehouse and on the pier and in the car, but a slower and more fundamental reckoning, the kind that happens when a person arrives at the actual question underneath all the other questions and has to answer it honestly. Then Celine turned to Damien. The arrangement, she said, 11 years ago. Was it ever about protecting you? Damien looked at her. What? The information I provided, the inquiry it redirected. Was redirecting that inquiry ever a primary goal for you, or was the inquiry itself? Was the federal pressure on your organization at that time? Was that manufactured? Was someone using federal investigative resources to pressure you into a specific operational posture? Damien was very still. Damien. I suspected it, he said. At the time, I suspected the inquiry had been pointed at my organization rather than originating from conventional investigative development. I didn't have proof. Because you didn't have Corva's ledger. Celine looked at the waterproof case in his hands. The ledger has the full operational record, including the record of how the inquiry was initiated. Gavin watched Corva's face across the water. It moved. Just slightly. Just enough. She used a federal investigation as a pressure tool, Gavin said, to put Damien in a position where he needed an exit. And Celine provided the exit, which created the arrangement, which gave Corva the document she's holding right now. He looked at Celine. She manufactured the situation that put you in debt to Damien 11 years ago. She built the leverage she's using right now 11 years before she needed it. Celine looked at Corva. Corva said nothing. That's in the ledger, Celine said. Not a question. A statement delivered to Corva across 20 yards of water as a confirmation rather than a discovery. The manipulation of the federal inquiry is in your own records. My records, Corva said, are going to the bottom of this harbor. They are not, Damien said. His voice had changed. It had dropped below the controlled register into something older and more fundamental. The voice of a man who has spent 50 years building a careful and functional understanding of the world, and has just been shown that the understanding was built on a foundation that someone else laid without his knowledge or consent, and is now deciding with complete clarity and no particular drama what he intends to do about it. He looked at Corva. You used my logistics infrastructure for 8 years, he said. You placed an asset inside a connected organization. You manufactured a federal investigation against my operation to create a dependency. And you have been, for 12 years, conducting a criminal enterprise whose exposure would be laid, in part, at my door. He paused. You have been exceptionally competent, and I have been, in ways I find genuinely offensive, careless. Corva held his gaze. She was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him, which was either the bravest or the most dangerous thing about her. And at this particular moment, on this particular body of water, the distinction between brave and dangerous had become entirely academic. The ledger, she said. No, Damien said. She looked at Ellery, who was in the bow of the inflatable, and something passed between them that was not verbal. Ellery reached under the inflatable's bow gunnel and came up with a flare gun, which he pointed at the yacht's waterproof case. The case goes in the water, Ellery said, or I put a flare through it from here. Gavin felt the situation arrive at its actual bottom. The place underneath all the legal architecture and financial documentation and 7 years of patient evidence collection, where what remained was 2 boats on gray water and a flare gun and the specific primitive physics of a confrontation that had exhausted its institutional options. He looked at Celine. She was looking at Ellery, at the flare gun, at the distance between the inflatable and the yacht. Then she reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone and made a call, and when it connected, she said 3 words. Execute the order. She hung up. Corva looked at her. I pushed the evidence package to the federal coordinator 40 minutes ago, Celine said. The accelerated timeline I initiated this morning included a secondary package, a copy of the ledger's contents, digitized, with independent forensic certification of authenticity, transmitted through a secure channel that does not route through any federal communication infrastructure that your inside person has visibility on. She paused. The 3 words I just said activated its delivery to a federal judge's secure inbox, not the task force. The judge. Direct. She looked at Corva steadily. You can put that flare through the original. It doesn't change what the judge has in front of them right now. The inflatable rocked on its own wake. Ellery looked at Corva. Corva looked at Celine. You didn't have a secondary package, Corva said. I've had visibility on your documentation process for... You've had visibility on the documentation process you knew about, Celine said. The secondary package was assembled using only materials that predate my association with Damien. Photographs. I took myself on a personal device that has never been connected to any infrastructure you or anyone in your network has ever touched. The chain of custody is entirely independent. She held Corva's gaze. It's not as comprehensive as the ledger, but it has your name, your actual name. And it has the manufacturing of the federal inquiry 11 years ago, documented through financial records that are entirely my own work. She paused. It's enough. The harbor was very quiet. A gull somewhere made its sound and stopped. Ellery lowered the flare gun. He didn't make a decision about it. His hand made the decision, the slow downward arc of an arm that had assessed the geometry of the situation and concluded that the geometry had changed. He set the flare gun on the inflatable's gunnel and put his hands flat on his thighs and looked at the water. Corva stood in the stern of the inflatable for a long moment. The outboard idled beneath her. The water moved. The sky above Crestholm Harbor had finally made its decision about rain and was beginning lightly to implement it. Small drops that made small rings on the surface of the basin and disappeared. She looked at Celine with the almost respect again, and this time it was past almost. How long have you had the personal device? She said. Since the 3rd year of my marriage, Celine said. I've been building the secondary package in parallel for 4 years, against exactly this contingency. Against me having leverage. Against anyone having leverage. Celine's voice was even. The entire architecture of this case was built so that no single point of failure could stop it. Not the federal team. Not Damien's resources. Not the original ledger. Not me. She paused. I made sure it could survive me not being here. Corva absorbed that. Then she sat down in the stern of the inflatable. Slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose legs have decided to be honest about the situation before the rest of them caught up. I want to speak to the federal coordinator directly, she said. Not through intermediaries. That's not my arrangement to make, Celine said. Then whose? Celine looked at Damien. Damien looked at the waterproof case in his hands. He looked at the rain beginning on the water. He looked at Corva in the inflatable with the expression of a man who has decided on a specific course of action and is in the process of accepting its costs. Mine, he said. I'll make the contact, directly. The ledger transfers as evidence, along with my full account of how my infrastructure was used. In exchange for... He paused. The pause had the weight of someone who had spent 50 years avoiding this specific room and had now walked into it and closed the door behind them. In exchange for whatever consideration the federal team sees fit to extend to an organization that was itself a victim of the network it's being asked to help dismantle. Corva looked at him for a long moment. You'll cooperate with a federal investigation, she said. I'll cooperate with this one, Damien said, against this specific target, with defined scope and independent legal representation at every step. He held her gaze. You made me complicit in something I didn't choose. This is how I undo that. The arrests came in waves over the following 18 hours. Corva, whose actual name was Margaret Voss, a fact that became public in the federal filing and had the slightly deflating quality that true names often had when attached to figures who had been operating under the weight of an alias, was taken into federal custody at the harbor from the inflatable by agents who had been holding position at the basin entrance since Celine's three-word call activated the judge's inbox and triggered the warrant sequence. Ellery was arrested at the dock. He didn't resist. He sat in the back of a federal vehicle with his hands in his lap and his face doing the specific work of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for so long that the cessation of the performance had left a vacancy where an expression used to be. Purvis had already been detained, as the earlier message indicated. He cooperated immediately and completely, with the reflexive self-preservation of a man who had spent a career in political infrastructure and understood instinctively that the first person through the prosecutor's door got the best terms. His cooperation added 17 names to the federal case that hadn't been in any of Celine's documentation, names from a domestic political network that extended 3 states beyond Crestholm and would take federal investigators the better part of 2 years to fully map. The Mercer family's voluntary cooperation, delivered through a new attorney Gavin hired that evening, a federal defense specialist named Okafor, who had spent 20 years on the other side of these proceedings and knew exactly what voluntary production needed to look like to matter, was received by the federal team at 11:17 that night. The scope of it was broad enough to accelerate the financial forensics significantly and narrow enough that Gavin's independent legal position was meaningfully distinguished from his father's. Roland Mercer was charged. The charges were serious. His attorney negotiated an arrangement that involved full restitution to a list of identified victims, forfeiture of several of the offshore structures, and a sentence that a man of 67 with no prior record and demonstrable cooperation would serve, in part, in a facility that was not the facility he would have faced without the cooperation. Vivian Mercer was charged separately, on a narrower set of counts that reflected exactly what Celine had told Gavin in the warehouse. Not direction, but willful blindness and the acceptance of benefit from structures she had chosen not to examine. Her attorney argued the distinction aggressively. The federal prosecutor accepted a plea to reduced counts. The Mercer family name, which had been a kind of architecture in Crestholm for 40 years, became a case reference number in a federal filing and then slowly, over months, just a name again. Gavin served time. It was not a short sentence and it was not a comfortable one, and there was no version of it that was not what it was. The consequence of choices made over years by a person who had told himself a story about who he was that the choices didn't support. He served it in a federal facility 2 states from Crestholm, in a room that was smaller than any room he had ever voluntarily occupied, and he did not waste the time or perform rehabilitation for an audience. He read. He wrote letters he didn't send. He thought about the courthouse steps and the pen moving smoothly across the paper, and what he had believed that smoothness meant. He thought about Celine. Cora did not wait. He had not expected her to. She sent a message 3 weeks after the sentencing that was 3 sentences long and accurate in everything it said, and he read it twice and didn't respond, and that was that. Damien Orsini's cooperation with the federal investigation was, as he had specified, scoped and bounded and conducted through independent legal representation at every step. The terms were negotiated over 6 weeks and resulted in an arrangement that was not immunity. He was not a man who expected immunity and would not have trusted an arrangement that offered it, but a defined acknowledgement of cooperation that closed specific federal inquiries into his organization while leaving others open, which was a realistic outcome, and he was a realistic man. He never discussed the arrangement publicly. Neither did the federal team, which was itself a feature of the arrangement. He continued to operate in a reduced capacity in a world that had shifted around him in ways he was still assessing, and he did not pretend that the shift was smaller than it was. He and Celine spoke once, 4 months after the arrests, by phone. The conversation was 12 minutes long. Gavin was not present for it, and Celine did not repeat its contents, but afterwards she sat for a while at the desk in her new office and looked at the wall, and then made a cup of coffee and went back to work. The office was on the 4th floor of a building overlooking Crestholm Harbor. The foundation had taken 6 months to incorporate and another 3 to staff, and its first public action was the publication of a report on financial structures used to shield criminal enterprises from regulatory accountability, a report that 3 federal agencies cited in subsequent proceedings and that a legislative committee used as a basis for proposed disclosure requirements that were still, 18 months later, working their way through the relevant committees. The foundation was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that happened in spreadsheets and legal filings and meetings with regulators who had too much on their plates and too little time. Work that required the same sustained, precise, unglamorous patience that building a 7-year evidence case required. Celine was good at that kind of work. She had always been good at it. She hired 7 people in the first year, all of them from backgrounds in financial forensics or legal advocacy or both, none of them from Crest Holmes' established institutional network. She paid them adequately and demanded from them the kind of rigor that most employers in the field stopped short of demanding because it was uncomfortable, and all 7 of them stayed. The anonymous package arrived on a Thursday, 8 months after the foundation opened. It was addressed to Celine personally, at the foundation's office address, with no return address and a postmark from a city in another state. Inside was a USB drive and a single handwritten note that said, "You should know what almost happened." The drive contained a recording. The recording was an audio file, 37 minutes of a conversation between 2 men recorded in what sounded like a moving vehicle in a language Celine did not speak. She had it transcribed and translated by an independent service and then read the transcript twice, very carefully, in her office with the door closed. The conversation was between a financial broker connected to one of the criminal syndicates the federal investigation had peripherally identified, and a second man who was identified in the transcript by a name that Celine did not recognize. The conversation, dated approximately 2 years before Celine had married Gavin Mercer, described a strategy for engineering a conflict between the Mercer family's political network and the Orsini organization, a conflict that, if it had developed as planned, would have resulted in a significant amount of violence and the destruction of both entities, leaving the speaker's own organization in a dominant position in Crest Holmes' gray market financial landscape. The strategy had failed. It had failed because someone had identified the financial trail being used to fund the provocation and had intervened before the provocation could be delivered. The recording speakers discussed this failure with the specific frustration of people who had expected to win and had not understood why they had lost, and one of them said, in a translated passage that Celine read 3 times, "Whoever found the money trail found it before we even made the approach. Whoever it was, they were watching before we started watching. We never had the first move." Celine set the transcript down. She looked at the harbor through her office window. 8 months of familiarity with the view had made it ordinary in all the ways that genuine familiarity made things ordinary. She no longer saw the harbor as the place where the convoy of SUVs had sealed off the promenade and the black yacht had crossed the harbor entrance. She saw it as the view from her office. The water and the cranes and the container ships moving on the channel and the gray sky that in October looked the same as it had looked a year ago. She had found the money trail. 4 years into her marriage, before she had fully understood what she was building, while she had still been in the early stages of documenting what the Mercer family's structures were actually connected to, she had followed an anomalous transaction pattern that she had initially assumed was connected to the Mercer operation and had traced instead to an entirely different source. She had flagged it. She had documented it. She had passed the documentation to Damien's financial people because they had the capacity to investigate it in ways she didn't. And they had investigated it, and the investigation had apparently resolved the situation. And she had not followed up because she had been in the middle of building something else, and the anomaly had been resolved and she had moved on. She had not known what the anomaly was. She had not known that what she'd found was the financing for a provocation designed to start a war. She had not known that following a threat out of professional habit, because it was anomalous and anomalies required documentation, had prevented something that would have hurt a significant number of people who had no connection to any of the institutions she'd been working to dismantle. She had not known. She sat with that for a while. She had the recording verified by 2 independent forensic audio analysts. She had the translation confirmed by a certified service. She forwarded the file to the federal team with a cover memo identifying the relevant parties and recommending it be reviewed in the context of the ongoing investigation into the peripheral syndicates. She received an acknowledgement 3 days later, and then nothing, and then 8 weeks after that, a brief communication from a federal coordinator she had not previously interacted with, thanking her for the material and informing her that it had resulted in the identification and arrest of 3 individuals whose prosecution would proceed independently of the primary case. She filed the communication in the Foundation's records and went back to work. The last time she stood on the deck of Damien's yacht was in the early spring, 6 weeks before Gavin's sentencing, 14 months after the divorce papers had been signed on the courthouse steps. Damien had called and asked, and she had gone because the request had been specific and genuine, and he was not a man who made requests he didn't mean. They had motored out to the mouth of the harbor at dusk, just the 2 of them and a minimal crew, and anchored in the channel where the harbor opened into the wider bay, and the city's light was a low amber smear on the darkening horizon. He had made coffee again, the same ceramic mugs. She held hers the same way, both hands, the heat coming through. "The Foundation," he said. "It's going well. It's working. That's different from going well." "Yes," she said. "I know. It's working." He looked at the city light on the horizon. "Gavin's sentencing is next month." "I know. Will you go?" "No." He absorbed that. He didn't push it. He was not a man who pushed things he had received a clear answer about. "Are you done?" he asked. Not in the sense of finished, in the sense of whether she had reached a place where the work felt like a conclusion rather than a continuation. She thought about the question for a moment. She thought about the courthouse steps and the gray coat and the handbag with the tarnished clasp and the 7 years and the Sunday dinners and the thousands of hours of documentation and the warehouse and the harbor and the inflatable and Corva sitting down in the stern with her legs deciding to be honest before the rest of her caught up. She thought about the recording and the money trail she had followed 4 years ago without knowing what it was. She thought about all the things she had known and all the things she had not known and the specific texture of the difference between them. "No," she said. He nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected, and maybe the answer he'd hoped for. They drank their coffee in the quiet that 2 people who had been through something real together sometimes arrived at. Not comfortable exactly, not simple, but honest in the way that only the absence of anything left to perform could produce. The city light held on the horizon. The water moved under them. She was not Gavin's forgotten wife. She was not Damien's instrument. She was not the woman who had been publicly divorced on courthouse steps while her husband lit a cigarette with satisfaction. And she was not the architect of a perfect revenge, because what she had built had never been revenge. Revenge was a closed system, a transaction, a settling of accounts. What she had built was something that kept going after the accounts were settled. She was the woman who had followed an anomalous transaction because anomalies required documentation. She was the woman who had decided in year 3 of a marriage to a man she had stopped believing in that leaving was not the same as finishing, and that the work mattered more than her own comfort or her own freedom or the years of her life that the work was going to cost. She was the woman who had made all of that true and paid for all of it and was still, at the end of it, standing. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She finished the coffee. She handed the mug back to Damien. She looked at the harbor entrance and the open water beyond it, the darkness where the bay became the channel and the channel became the ocean, the place where the light from the city stopped and the stars, if you waited for your eyes to adjust, began. She watched it until her eyes adjusted. Then she went inside.